Good afternoon. This is our first speaker program that we are doing in the afternoon back on the East Coast, and I guess it's the morning on the West Coast and evening time for those of you who are now able to join us from Israel. Our guest today is joining us from Israel. Rabbi Daniel Gordis is Koret Distinguished Fellow at Shalem College. He's the author of 13 books and the widely read blog and podcast, Israel from the Inside. Gordis's Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn was named the 2016 National Jewish Book Awards Book of the Year. His writing has appeared in magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times, the New Republic, the New York Times Magazine, Azure, Commentary Magazine, Time, The Atlantic, and Foreign Affairs. In 2014, the Jerusalem Post listed him as one of the world's 50 most influential Jews, while Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic has written, quote, "If you asked me, of all the people you know, who cares the most about the physical, moral, and spiritual health of Israel, I would put Daniel Gordis at the top of the list." His most recent book, Impossible Takes Longer, 75 years after its creation, Has Israel Fulfilled its Founder's Dreams, was awarded Yeshiva University's Rabbi Sachs Book Prize for 2023. Gordis and his wife live in Jerusalem. They have 3 married children and several grandchildren, and that's actually how I got to know Danny initially. His daughter Talia and son-in-law Avishai, who was a guest on our program a few weeks ago, have been living in Cambridge for, I think, about 7 years, while Avishai was doing a PhD and Talia doing a master's, and I've gotten to know them very well and their children. And Danny, it's really a pleasure to have you join us here today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And I also especially want to thank our sponsors for this evening's program, this afternoon's program, Dan and Elizabeth Jick. They have been longtime supporters and fans of this program. We're so grateful for your support. Danny, I wanted especially to have you on during this time because I have always found you to be someone who cares so deeply about Israel. Was also very nuanced and very honest. And so I want to begin by asking you, how has this week been for you? Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom HaZikaron are often a very emotionally filled week. But how are you feeling this Yom Ha'atzmaut, this Yom HaZikaron, and how is this different from previous years?
How is this week different from all other weeks? So first of all, Danny, once again, thank you for having me. It's an honor. And I also very much enjoyed our interactions back in the days when we were hanging out a lot in Cambridge. And it's nice to reconnect in this way. Obviously, you're right. Yom HaZikaron and Yom Ha'atzmaut are very complicated under the best of times, because if nothing else, the transformation from Yom HaZikaron to Yom Ha'atzmaut itself is very, very hard. They didn't actually used to be together at the beginning of the state. They were not next to each other, but at the end of the Knesset passed a law moving them next to each other. And that led to a thing called a Tekes Ma'avar, which is a kind of a transformation ceremony people do towards the end of Yom HaZikaron, and it gradually morphs into something a little bit more joyous in Yom Ha'atzmaut. So it's always a difficult transformation, no matter what, and it's always therefore a very fraught week under the best of circumstances. Last year was not the best of circumstances. We had hoped to celebrate the 75th with a tremendous outpouring of joy, but we were, of course, in the middle of a horrible national divide over judicial reform. So there was a feeling this year that, oh my God, really 2 really lousy Yom Ha'atzmaut celebrations in a row? But you can't count the number of people who said that to you on the street. Look, here's the irony. Yom HaZikaron was horrible, but we expected it to be horrible. I went to Har Herzl in the afternoon of Yom HaZikaron, and that was the throngs had already left. The official ceremonies were already over. There were some groups there, American high school students, probably yeshiva programs, seminary programs with their people being taught. And we went to all the obvious regular places. And at the very last minute, somebody who was with me said, "I want to go to the new Chelka. I want to go to the new area where all the new graves are since October 7th, because they do them in groups." And so we walked up there. It wasn't very far at all. And you go from a relatively empty cemetery where people are standing around talking, it's very quiet, to a place where there are hundreds of people jammed into a space wailing. It was so heartbreaking. I just took a look and left. I just couldn't bear it. The graves are fresh. The grief is fresh. The graves keep getting filled up more and more. We lost 5 guys last night. It's just unbearably hard. The irony is that Yom Ha'atzmaut, many people have said here, felt worse because we expected Yom HaZikaron to be terrible, and it was terrible. Yom HaAtzmaut we thought would be a little bit better, and it actually wasn't. It was a very go through the motions kind of a day. It's very fraught time here. This is a very, very grave time in Israel's history. This is probably the exception of maybe the very first part of the War of Independence, without a doubt, the most dangerous point that Israel's ever had in its own history. And there's a tremendous sense of being stuck, of being afraid, of not being able to defend ourselves. So it was a hard week. It was a hard week. And, I think David Horowitz of the Times of Israel wrote in his op-ed this week, Yom HaAtzmaut was not much to celebrate. And, that kind of captured it. So Yom HaZikaron was painful. Yom HaAtzmaut was surprisingly, actually, in an ironic way, almost more difficult.
Hearing you talk, my sister, who may have felt somewhat similarly, she's a rabbi in New York. She called a cousin of ours, who's a 98-year-old Holocaust survivor who lives in Netanya, has been there since the founding of the state. And he said to her the following. He said, "I reject any comparison of the events of October 7th to the Shoah. October 7th was a devastating pogrom, but the people in this country who were referring to it as a Shoah, they did not live through the Shoah. I'm in the minority here, but I really do feel that we can celebrate this year. We are here. There is still an Am Yisrael, a Medina Israel." And I'm curious for you whether you agree or disagree with him. For me, there was something about his own historical perspective and experience that shifted a bit of, how to view this moment. You're someone who's written a lot about the history of Israel, history of Zionism. When you sort of look back at the history of Zionism, what are some lessons, I guess, that you learned that might shape how we should view this moment, might be different from just how we would view it without that historical context?
Well, I think he's absolutely right, by the way. This was not the Shoah. I mean, obviously the numbers are completely different, but aside from that, this was different in a multitude of ways, including the fact that we were able at the end of the day to defend ourselves. I mean, it took way too long and it took too many days, but at the end of the day, we were able to at least stop the attack. We haven't been able to resolve the war, but we're able to kill all the terrorists who had infiltrated Israel. They were roaming around for 3 or 4 days. Which was a kind of a creepy thing, but we found them all, and presumably, and ended it. So it's different from the Shoah in a whole array of ways. So the most important being that we had power, which is something that was not the case back then. But look, there's a lot of ways in which, and I totally understand that his point is that anybody who would make the comparison didn't live through it. Of course, that's true, and obviously I didn't live through it. But I will say, as a reader of history of both this and that, there are images that are hauntingly similar. Little children hiding in closets for 12 hours. They're 5, 6, 7 years old. They know that their parents are dead outside the closet, and they have to hide in there for 12 hours because until they hear Hebrew, somebody saying, Zetzal or something like that. There are people running. I watched a video today of a really very moving video on N12 about an Arab man from Rahat, a Bedouin from Rahat, who was actually working at a farm near the party, who saved 8 guys who had fled the party, made their way to his farm. They hid under a house. I mean, how similar does this sound? And they prayed the whole time that he wasn't going to turn them in. And he said, Bedouins don't turn people in. In the film, he said, of course I wasn't going to turn them in. Bedouins don't do that. But they had no way of knowing that he was a Bedouin versus something else. They weren't in the middle of doing a sociological or anthropological study. And they were petrified. And this image to me of these 8 guys talking about hiding under a house, hearing the terrorists just outside with their boots, or with their sneakers or whatever they were. The images are horrifyingly similar. No, this was not the Shoah. It's very important to say that. But it is horrifyingly similar in the sense of vulnerability. I think that what happened here is that Europe came to Israel. It's not that Shoah repeated, but that's something that we thought we had relegated in Jewish history to over there. Pogroms happened over there. That's where we're helpless. That's where we're victimless. We left there to come here and start something new. We've had wars. We've had plenty of wars, and lots of people have been killed. Very few civilians, by the way, over the course of years, except in, obviously terror attacks. But this was more like a war than a terror attack when 3,000 terrorists come across the border. So I think it brought back a sense of the powerlessness and the vulnerability of Europe, which has left people stunned. And what I think is even more stunning is if you had said to people on October 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, we're going to be 7 months into this, and Hamas is still going to be able to fire rockets at Sderot during a Yom HaAtzmaut, celebration. Or I was walking home today from a meeting at a foundation not too far from here, and it was about a 30-minute walk. And I was just listening to Galei Tzahal, the Israeli army radio on these guys as I was walking home. And every few minutes there would be a silence. The song would stop, and there'd be this booming voice that would say, "Enemy infiltrating aircraft in Kiryat Shmona, go to a protected space." I was in Jerusalem, nothing to do. But really, I mean, this many months in, there are still, and they're not aircraft, they're drones, but it's the same alarm. People here are feeling stunned by the fact that we have not been able to defend ourselves. You have 100,000 people from the north who the country is saying, the government is saying we're going back for the school year. But there's actually all kinds of rumors in the press now that the government's already actually contracting out for schools for them in other places for next year. So even the government doesn't believe its own verbiage. So we're stunned by our, not powerlessness, to be sure, but our inability to keep ourselves safe. People can't move back to the Oteif. People can't move back to Gaza. The number of soldiers that are getting buried keeps climbing incrementally, but still steadily. It's a very, 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 it's a time that feels very, very vulnerable.
It's interesting. The last I saw you, I don't know if you remember this, but it was on Har Herzl, I don't know, October 10th or so. There was a funeral for a lone soldier, and a blast had gone out.
The British young man, yeah.
Yeah. And while we were there, there was a siren still. They were happening regularly in Jerusalem, and everyone's nowhere to run. It's a cemetery, so everyone just kind of ducked down. And I definitely then had an intense feeling of vulnerability. And granted, I was in Jerusalem afterwards, but that certainly faded, I think, over the next few weeks. And so I'm curious just to hear, you've already articulated a little bit, but how do you handle that? Meaning those first few days where there was a sense of intense vulnerability, okay, but 7 months later, how's your thinking shifted? How has that continued sense of powerlessness affected your own view of the state and sort of your general hopes for what can happen?
Look, I don't personally, I mean, the ultimate vulnerable moment is when you turn on television and it says, yeah, they've launched 300 things. Some of them will be there in 2.5 hours and some of them will be there in 9 hours. We actually went to sleep. I mean, my kids and their kids had come to our house because we have a safe room and they don't have a safe room. So they drove down because they knew they weren't going to be here for a couple of hours. It's the weirdest thing in the world, right? They tell you it's been fired, but they got in the car, they drove down, whatever. We're all here. We went to sleep. We heard the siren. We got up. We were all climbing into the mamad. We're all hanging out there. And then we heard the explosions in the sky and the building was shaking a little bit, not a ton. It was surreal to know that Iran is firing at you. And by the way, it's surreal that didn't become very big news. Like, it was a very big deal for a few days. And now the news is back at Gaza, but a sovereign state actually attacked Israel with 300 missiles. Some people say they were meant to be shot down. Some people say they weren't meant to be shot down. I don't have access to that. But even then, I didn't feel terribly vulnerable. I just felt like it's probably going to be okay. I think that much more dangerous right now than even the enemy power and the fact that we can't win this war, which people are beginning to say pretty openly, all sorts of people. But the fact that we can't win this war is very, very disturbing and very frightening for what it means for the future. But I think what has people much more worried at the moment is, as Avi Sakharov put it in a piece that went out on Ynet like about an hour ago, literally just an hour ago, this country is being held hostage by a prime minister. That was his argument. And like, that's where our problem is here right now. So if at the international court now, if South Africa is accusing Israel of genocide and then quoting Naftali Ben-Gvir, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who has said explicitly we should wipe out these villages, well, that's pretty good evidence, right? In a normal world, he'd be fired. He would have been long since gone, but Bibi won't do it because he's worried about the fragility of his coalition. We're being held hostage in that way. We desperately, desperately need more soldiers. We need to draft the Haredim. We're short of manpower. We've learned in the most horrible way that technology is not going to win this war. It is going to be young men and young women wearing helmets with boots and guns and going out to the front. We need more people, and this is not going to be over anytime soon. And we would have a draft law that would bring some of the Haredim in. And the rumor was the Haredim had actually agreed to about a third of the group getting drafted, which is already thousands of people. It's a huge step forward. But Bibi has not pushed that one through and is trying to push an old one through. That is creating a tremendous sense of deja vu. There's a sense here that we need to have a conversation about what's happening in Gaza when this is over. The world wants us to have it. Israel wants to have it. Herzl Halevi, who's the commander-in-chief, says the reason that we're still fighting in the center and the north is because we haven't put anybody else in. And as long as there's a vacuum, Hamas is going to keep popping up there. So kids are getting killed fighting in areas where we've already cleansed them, so to speak. But Bibi doesn't want to have a conversation about the day after. I mean, I could go on and on, but I won't. There's a sense here that everywhere you turn, this country has hit a dead end. There's no good options here. Now, when you're losing a war or not winning a war, you tend not to have great options. But we would have much better options if we had a leader who was willing to think about what are we doing the day after and have a national conversation about that. If we had a leader who was not distrusted, to put it very mildly, by the White House and many people on Capitol Hill. If we had a leader who was not seen by many people across the nation, across the world, as being callous and uncaring, not clamping down on Jewish violence in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria. So I think the sense of being stuck, being despondent almost, that you feel in the air here, is coming not so much from the military side, from the political side. And I don't know if you saw that yesterday or the day before, I guess it was on Yom Ha'atzmaut, it was 2 days ago, Mishael Tzion, who's a very well-known writer, and he's the author of a Haggadah and so forth, put out a piece in the Times of Israel. How are we going to know that it's time to leave? Like, what's the red line that gets crossed when it's time to leave this country? The fact that a guy like Mishael Tzion, who is about as Zionist and committed to this country as a person can possibly be, would even as a theoretical, not stunt, but as a theoretical thought experiment, put that out there in the Times of Israel, just gives you a little bit of a sense of where people's hearts and souls are. It's a really heartbreaking time. Some of it's about the war, and a lot of it's our own inability to regroup and to try to address that.
Wow, so there's a lot that you've touched on. Maybe we'll unpack some of that. I do want to remind our audience we'll have a few minutes for questions towards the end. If you'd like to ask a question, there's a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Click that, type your question in. Only do so if you're prepared to come on screen. And then if we select your question, we'll invite you to come on and ask your question directly to Danny. So I know Michelle well. We both learned at Malay Goboa. We both learned at Yeshivat Cholavei Torah. And in that piece, he writes, the worst case scenario I fear most deeply is not the sadistic terrorism of Sinwar or the direct missiles of Iran's Revolutionary Guard. The worst I fear is from the actions of my own government. If we leave Israel, and may that day never arrive, it will be because we lost the internal struggle for what Israel is and needs to be. So you've said, though, that even on the military level, it sounds like you're saying we can't win this war, or Israel can't win this war.
Or we're not winning it so far, put it that way.
Mm-hmm. But can you talk a little bit more and you've touched on a number of different points about distrust of Bibi, the Haredi draft law. What's your thinking about that internal struggle? And I'm also curious how much of that is brought out by the war, how much of it was really going back already to last Yom Ha'atzmaut when you said you felt it was hard to celebrate in the normal way.
Look, so let's start with that. I mean, last year was a horrible year in Israel. I mean, people as thoughtful and not exaggerating types, for example, Yitzhak Herzog, Yedidya Stern. I mean, there's people that are very grounded, very thoughtful. They both happen to be lawyers. They both said we're edging towards the precipice of civil war, and they didn't mean that hyperbolically. Ari Shavit, who's the very famous author of My Promised Land, which was, and I think maybe still is, a bestseller many years later. He wrote a column in I think it was Makor Rishon during the judicial crisis, in which he said the issue is not civil war. They are going to attack us because of this. We are broadcasting weakness, and we are inviting an attack. It's going to happen. And he told me, I went to see him at his house a couple months ago, and he told me that when the sirens went off on that Shabbat morning, his wife said to him, what the hell is that? And he said, it's the next Lebanon war. Now, he was wrong. It wasn't coming from Lebanon. It was coming from Gaza. But he got that part very much right. So look, I think this country was very divided for a whole array of reasons. And that, by the way, was also, if you're the prime minister of the country, let's just say hypothetically that the judicial reform that you're putting through is in every respect the best way to go. And you have lots of jurisprudential minds who say that that's the way to go. When you have a country so split and people are literally protesting 39 weeks in a row in Kaplan Square, and pilots are stopping to fly, and people are not showing up for the reserves, and doctors are signing up to leave the country, What you say is, wait, I'm going to stop this. We're going to have a national conversation. But that at that point, it wasn't Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. At that point, it was Levin and Rothman. They both said to Bibi, if you stop this, we're out. And then you lose your coalition. So it's sort of the same game, just with a few different cards in your hand. And so the irony of October 7th, the horrible, tragic irony of October 7th is that it forced us to heal. It forced us to actually see lots of guys in tanks for months on end, who, one's religious and one's not. And one is, left wing and one is right wing and one was pro-reform and one was anti-reform and whatever. But they're in the same tank for months and they all came out of Gaza and they all said, we can actually make this work. We actually want to have a new kind of discourse and we want to reduce the toxicity of the way in which we speak to each other and so on and so forth. October 7th gave us that opportunity. But I think most people in Israel would say that 7 months in, we have squandered most of it. The political infighting and the napping at each other, mostly inside the right, but now between the right and the center also, is returning. And so it's a devastatingly sad thing to know that we have these kids on the front who are fighting like lions. We're not 1,000% certain anymore that what they're being sent to do is really doable or worth it. And I say that as somebody who's got a son who was in, who's going back in soon. It's a terrible feeling. It's a horrible feeling when your kid's going in and he's got 2 kids and it's just a very bad feeling. But when you couple that to a sense is, are we sending him into stuff that just literally can't be done, that can't be won? It's a heartbreak. It's really a heartbreaking sentiment. And I think that's what really Israelis are feeling. That's what led to Michel Tzion's, sort of cri de coeur, I would call it. It's just a sense. Now he's talking about, I think the example that he gave there was that if Ben-Gvir became defense minister, then he's gone because he's not going to have his 4 daughters serving in an army, which is under Ben-Gvir. I actually hadn't even thought about that. When I read it, I was like, oh my God, that could actually happen. I don't really think that will happen. But he's polling very well, by the way. Smotrich is not, but Ben-Gvir is polling very well for the next elections, which we should keep in mind. But I don't, for me, that's part of my worry is a little bit different. My worry about, and I'm not talking about leaving, but I'm also a different generation. I mean, I've said this to myself. I've had this conversation with myself many times. We lived our lives. Like we're not old and dying, but our kids are raised, our kids are all married, our kids all have kids. I'm in the process of slowly, retiring and all of that. We've lived our lives, and I don't really feel that I would be cheated personally out of anything if the rest of my life didn't play out the way that I had thought it was going to play out. If they're not going to come over the border, but yeah, if they came over the border, you die defending it with whatever you have. That's not even a question. I'm not getting on a plane to fly out of here. You die defending it to whatever extent you can, and you get killed in the process. You get killed in the process. But I don't really think that's the reality. I think that what I'm most worried about is that other people who have their, a generation or 2 of life ahead of them are going to say, this is just not how I want to raise my kids. I don't want my kids going to this kind of an army. I don't want my kids living in this kind of a political system. Now, by the way, where they're going to go to is not so clear because, the golden in Medina is not exactly as golden as it used to be. But leaving that aside for a moment, I could see a world in which this just literally becomes less and less and less of a successful country, where all of the geographically mobile people who can begin to take leave, and economically it begins to become less interesting, and culturally and intellectually and academically it becomes less interesting. And I could see, 20 years from now, it's just a kind of a faint shadow of itself, probably more of a vassal state of the United States than it already is. That's a sad, heartbreaking image for me. When we got here 25 years ago, shortly after we got here, Ehud Olmert defeated Bibi Netanyahu, and he made 3 promises: getting out of Lebanon, making peace with the Syrians, and making peace with the Palestinians. We did get out of Lebanon 18 years after we'd gone in. But we're more or less stuck in everything else, where Ehud Barak said we were going to be unstuck in 1999. So that's the sense of sort of having your feet stuck in this tar, the tar pit kind of feeling.
And so given that, how do you think of sort of big questions that are currently on the table? Let's say like what Israel should do with Rafah. Should they go in? Are the military objectives as they're stated at all possible?
You've given a lot of sort of sobering words. I'm not a military guy. right? I'm just not, I'm an army guy, so I have no basis on which to make that judgment other than what I read in the press along with what everybody else reads in the press. Here's what I can say, though. We have in our synagogue the family of one of the hostages. I mean, the hostage himself grew up in our synagogue, and his parents are still members of the synagogue, and are his siblings and all of that. And it's a very closely knit shul. I mean, it's a kehillah in the full sense of that word, and in that regard, it's a very heartbroken kehillah. You know, father sits there typically, the mother sits there typically. He used to sit here, blah blah blah. It's heartbreaking, and my own view is that I do believe the people who are on the negotiating team who have said now in several different iterations their work was made impossible by a prime minister who did not want a deal. I wasn't present there. I'm not privy to the conversations, but they said, for example, they were very close to a deal, and then Bibi insisted on a list of the hostages who were going to be given out, as opposed to just the categories. And for whatever reason, everybody knew, I don't know why, but everybody knew Hamas was not going to give that list. Perhaps because they didn't want to reveal who we had. I don't have any idea. But all the hostage negotiators said afterwards, well, we didn't need that list. We need the hostages, not the list. So if they're going to give us 30 people, they're going to give us 30 people. What do you, and they said that's partly when that particular round fell apart. My own view is that morally, Israel owes it to these people to get them back no matter what. No matter what. We have to get them back. Am I saying everybody for everybody? No, I'm not saying that. I can't make that decision. I understand that Sinwar got out in the Gilad Shalit deal. I understand that. And he is an evil genius, and he's running circles around us. And he may not even be in Rafiah. People say now he's probably moved to Khan Yunis or wherever he is. I don't have any idea. But it feels to me that the government needs to, l'shader, to communicate, to broadcast, to emote a sense that these hostages are our responsibility. We failed them. We completely failed them. And we owe it to them first to get them back. And if there's any way to get them back, even if you leave 4 battalions of Hamas, which you can take out at a later time, you can always start a war again. I mean, that's, not entirely great idea, but it's not impossible. But we don't have much time for these hostages. I mean, when you read, if you listen to Sheryl Sandberg's very, very well done movie, I think, Screams Before Silence, and you listen to the very few women there who talk about what they actually went through in 50 days. Now we're at 223, I think. You got to get these people out. And that's that the mood in the country is that who's keeping the hostage issue front and center is the protesters, the families of the hostages and the protesters who've joined them, not the government. And if the government could will that issue away, it would prosecute the war and worry about the hostages later. That feels to me like an enormous moral failure. I don't care if you're left, you're right, religious, you're secular, it doesn't matter to me. These people are in hell. I mean, literally in hell, because we failed them. And that's our first obligation, to get them out. It doesn't feel at this moment like a huge national priority or a huge governmental priority. Again, there might be things going on behind the scenes that I'm not privy to, and I'm sure there are, as well there should be. But I think what has many people here really distressed is that the government's not communicating a sense that that is the front and center objective to get however many of them are still alive. I mean, who knows? I'm sure many of them are dead, but some are alive. We know that for a fact. We got to get them out.
I'm curious, you brought up sort of the current Israeli administration and how it's dealing with the American administration. What do you make of Biden and how the U.S. has handled this, both going back 7 months and also more recently?
I think I actually reflect a lot of Israelis here. This is not just me, who feel that Joe Biden has been unbelievably supportive of Israel. I mean, certain people use the phrase, Joe Biden is the first genuinely, authentically Zionist president the United States has ever had. I mean, our relationships with the U.S. until Johnson were not much. I mean, France was our major arms supplier during the 67 war. And Kennedy was no big fan of Ben-Gurion's and so on and so forth. But Johnson turned things around, and we've had our ups and our downs since then. We've had a lot of presidents who said the right thing and felt the right thing, some presidents who didn't feel the right thing. But when Joe Biden spoke about, at the very, very beginning, about that black hole in your chest that wants to suck everything up, that's the way that he spoke. Everybody understood here, this was not teleprompter Joe Biden. This was Joe Biden who'd lost a wife and lost a son and understood the horrible tragedy of having family members grabbed from you by fate. And when he spoke, people here felt embraced. Whatever one wants to say about what Joe Biden's done in the last few weeks about limiting arms, and I'll come back to that in a second, it's given us a very, very, very long leash. I mean, we still are getting American arms, and we're 7 months into a war that is not at all helping his electoral prospects. So, I mean, I think a lot of people here who are fairly sophisticated about American politics say Joe Biden's job is not to look out for Israel's interests. Joe Biden is the president of the United States of America, and he wants to get elected. Those are his legitimate first two priorities. That's fair. And given that, many people here feel that he's been actually extraordinary. I feel he's been actually extraordinary. My own take on the recent embargo of the 2,000-pound bombs, which he says he's not giving to Israel right now because we don't need them to drop them. He doesn't want us dropping them on Rafah. Okay. First of all, the other arms shipments haven't stopped. Number two, if God forbid we needed those things to defend ourselves, I have no doubt whatsoever that they would be on their way. I don't have any doubt about that. But here is the problem. What Bibi Netanyahu is discovering, I think, is that you can actually lie to your coalition partners for years on end because you have almost unlimited power. And with if one nod and they're out and you'll replace them with somebody else. You can lie to the Israeli public for a very long time and pretty much get away with it because you have a coalition of 64 and there's no obvious mechanism for triggering an election. So you can get away with lying for a very, very long time, but not if you're lying to the President of the United States, because the President of the United States has a lot of cards in his hand. And when the president says, I want to have a conversation about the day after, and at first you say we are having it, it's just not public, but then it becomes clear you're not having it. When the President of the United States says, I don't want you to do this, and you are doing this, and so on and so forth, at a certain point, Joe Biden just says, I've had it. You know, I don't like being lied to by another head of state. I think most Israelis, and if you looked at Yediot Ahronot last week, it had a thing called the chronology of a crumbling relationship. And it wasn't what Joe Biden did to Bibi. It was what Bibi had done to Joe Biden. Some people trace this all the way back to Bibi's addressing a joint session of Congress under Obama, when Biden was, of course, the vice president, and Obama clearly did not want him to do that address. And he stepped on the face of the president of the United States. Now, you can not like Obama, that's fine, but he still was the president of the United States. I think most Israelis feel, A, that if we absolutely need the weapons, we're going to get them, and we're still getting most. And that 90%, I won't say 98, but 90% of this is our own doing by having a head of state who literally nobody believes anymore. Literally nobody believes a word that he says. And we're finding out that there's a huge, huge international cost to that.
I want to sort of stay on America, and I'm curious, we're not exclusively a university audience, but we are primarily a university audience. I believe your alma mater is Columbia, is that right?
Yes, I'm very proud.
So when you from 5,500 miles away, what's your sort of vantage point on what's going on in Columbia, at Harvard, other schools? There are distinctions between those schools, yeah, but how do you see
they're not all the same? Look, the eruption of there's so many things wrong with these protests. We don't have to go into them all, but I mean, I'll just point out a couple. I mean, when you have people who are holding up pride flags at protests that are essentially in favor of Hamas, there's something so convoluted about that thinking that you don't know where to start. So, chickens for KFC kind of thing. I mean, it's just ludicrous. So this was really not about the Palestinians. Most of these people on those protests didn't know anything about the conflict, had no idea. When they said from the river to the sea, they couldn't even tell you what river. Many of them, literally, people asked them, they didn't know what river they were talking about. When you say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that means that if I didn't have an American passport, which I do happen to have, but if I didn't have a passport, where am I supposed to go? Like, if the river from the sea, Palestine will be free, what are you saying to me and my children and my grandchildren if we only have Israeli passports? We're supposed to what? Be homeless? We're supposed to be refugees? We're supposed to be slaughtered? I mean, they're calling for genocide. That's the great irony. Israel's being tried for genocide, and they're calling for genocide, but not obviously of the Palestinians, but of us. So there was that was completely reprehensible to my mind. When you hear the testimony of students, both at Harvard and at Columbia, and there was a hearing at the House, I guess, yesterday or today, when a couple of Harvard students spoke at the House about what Harvard students have. This was the first that I'd heard this kind of an account. It's pretty horrifying. And even if people want to quibble with the details around the edges, it's clearly not all fabricated. Look, at Columbia, the protest was illegal. It was just illegal. I don't know what the story was at Harvard, but the protest was illegal at Columbia. They were told that they were in violation of this policy and that policy. And it was only when they actually forcibly broke into a building. And by the way, who in their right mind does not bring insecurity to Hamilton Hall when you know that in every student protest, Hamilton Hall gets taken over? There's lots of entrances into Hamilton Hall that are not from the quad. You can get into the building from lots of ways. They could have sent lots of people in to be on the inside, not to be on the outside. It was handled completely horribly. But look at what's happening in the college scene in America is just heartbreaking. I had such a fabulous experience at Columbia, and it feels defiled to me. It feels just, who would want to ever go step back on campus? It just, I don't know. It's heartbreaking about the ease with which young American students on an issue that they know nothing about, literally nothing, virtually, will start screaming epithets that are about the death of a people that came to this place because it was fleeing genocide in Europe. Not to say we're perfect. We're far from perfect. And this war has been handled terribly. We've handled lots of things terribly. But the response to that is to call for this people that has nowhere else to go, to have nowhere to be. If that's where the moral compass of young American students are, America's in for a very, very turbulent generation or two.
I've got two final questions for you, then I'll move to the audience. The first is, you talked about the potential civil war that was happening, a year ago, and those divides. There are certainly divides that are existing now between elements of the American Jewish community within itself, American Jewish community, the Israeli Jewish community. You're someone who in the past, I don't think you would do it again now, but you had a long series with Peter Beinart years ago. And I think one of the last times you were at Harvard Hillel was alongside him. Have you been in conversation with people who you might put on the other side, whether those are other Jews or Palestinians? How can we sort of mend some of those breaches, those divides that are emerging?
Inside the American Jewish community, you mean? Internal to the American Jewish community?
I'd say internal. I'm also curious also within Israeli-Palestinian, if that's something that I don't know if you're engaged in also.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit, not as much. There's a lot of people here, and I would include myself in this to a certain extent, who in general are very actually open to discourse with Israeli Palestinians. And I've had, Palestinian, Israeli Palestinian, other Palestinian guests on my podcast. And, it's all very important, and it's critically important, and it's never been more important. And we should take some great pride, by the way, in the fact that the Israeli Arab community has responded the way that it has. This is not May 2021, where we had all that internal violence, had none of that. And they actually went to the civilian command centers and helped give out food and clothing. And Rahat, a Bedouin community in the Negev, built a huge civilian command center. And people have done really extraordinary things. We should just note that. I think that's really very important to know. So I think that's critically important. I mean, there's people who are more involved in it than I am on a regular basis. Now, I think most people that I know who are involved in it, it's shut down right now. First of all, you're talking about Palestinians, most of them can't get in to have the conversation. And you can do it online, obviously, but it's not the same thing. But I want to focus on the American Jewish community for a second. I think that, look, there's people, like you mentioned, Peter, Saul mentioned, Peter. If you are explicitly opposed to the existence of a Jewish state, which he is, then I think you've crossed the line from being a critic of Israel to being an enemy of the Jewish people. And I know that is actually a very harsh thing to say, but I said it advisedly. I think if you oppose the existence of the state that has made the rebirth of the Jewish people after the Holocaust possible, you oppose the existence of that, not critical of this policy or that, then you at a certain point of cross-lining to being an enemy of the Jewish people. That's a very painful thing for me to say, but I've felt that way for a while since he published that essay about Yavne. So with him, I mean, for me, there's no conversation to be had. But there are a lot of people with whom I disagree, and that's fine. I mean, but what are the disagreements? Going into Rafah, not going into Rafah, those are always silly conversations because neither I nor they have all the military information you would need to be able to make a choice about that. It's not a useful conversation. We should bomb this. We shouldn't bomb that. How do I know what we should bomb? I'm not a pilot. I'm not a military guy. I don't know where the other people are. So what are the conversations that we do talk about, which I think can be meaningful conversations? So there are people, I think the most prominent exponent of this view is Sharon Brous, also a rabbi, who has, I think really, as David Wolpe, who's associated with Harvard these days, has himself said publicly, she's transformed Judaism into what he calls liberal politics. liberal politics kind of with a twist of Judaism on the top. And his argument with her, he said, is that he's, and this was in the LA Times article that came out about her not that long ago. He said that he's had this conversation with her endlessly. He doesn't think Judaism is liberal politics. It's much more than any sort of politics. So there's a conversation to be had about to what extent should Judaism be about politics as opposed to being about that and much, much more. That's an interesting conversation to be had. There's an interesting conversation to be had about whether you can sustain a Judaism that has excised Zionism from it. I think the future of that Judaism is going to be a very short-lived one. Because here's the experiment that I would have people do. Take all those people in the non-Zionist or anti-Zionist American Jewish camp and tell them, I want you to have an hour conversation about Judaism that does not involve Tikkun Olam and that does not involve Israel or its enemies or Arabs or anything of the sort. Just have a different conversation. Nothing to talk about. And it's not only that there's not a lot of knowledge there, there's not a lot of passion there. In other words, what gets people, there's got to be something in Jewish life that gets you passionate other than the Israeli-Arab conflict. I would say that about the people on the other side of the divide as well. But there, I think we're in somewhat better shape. There's a lot more traditional learning going on in much of that community. There's a lot more engagement with other ideas of Jewishness. So I think those people who are, having the anti-Zionist Seder, which happened somewhere in California, I forget where, before Pesach. That's not a form of Judaism that has any chance of sustaining itself, if you ask me, because a Judaism predicated on being opposed to something can't survive. Judaism's got to be about something positive, about a certain take on the world, a certain take on morality, a certain take on engagement with human beings, a certain take on the divinity of every human being, whatever you want to be. And we should be able to articulate, by the way, how that's different from a Protestant take on the world, other than the fact that it's in Hebrew, has different proof texts. We should be able to articulate that. So I think in the American Jewish community, those parts of the community that are now going to be about being separated from Israel are going to end up not being around for very long. It's just not going to be interesting after a while, and I think people will disappear. And then here's going to be the challenge for American Jews, and then the challenge for Israelis. And with this, I'll stop. American Jews are going to have to understand that Israel is very rapidly transforming itself from Athens to Sparta. We're going to have to try to hold on to as much Athens as we possibly can. But we are now going to be Sparta for as long as the eye can see. The number of guns in shul, when I'm in shul these days, is just, it's ridiculous. And it actually makes me sad, not because I'm opposed to guns, not because of that. I see these 19, 21-year-old kids who are away from the army for a weekend coming in with their weapons. It breaks my heart that these 21-year-old kids who at Harvard would be juniors here are on Sunday morning going back to battle for the right of their people to have a homeland. There's something so unbelievably devastating about that 76 years in. But we're going to become Sparta. We already have become Sparta. We're likely to remain Sparta for, I think, as long as the eye can see. And American Jews are going to have to accommodate themselves, if they want to be part of this, to an Israel that is not the Athens that it was. Hopefully we can retain many of the elements of Athens, but it's not going to be what it was. It's going to be armed to the teeth. It's going to take people out preemptively. We're going to be in a low-level state of war, I think, but a much higher low-level state of war than we've been in for many, many decades. This is going to be a new Israel that's not going to be comfortable for everyone. By the same token, Israelis, I think, are going to need to understand that American Jews are facing their own Jewish trauma. And that what's happening to the American Jewish community is as devastating for them as what's happening here is for us. They're two very different kinds of devastation. They share certain characteristics, obviously anti-Semitism at the core, but they share other things as well. But I think we're going to need to be an Israel that embraces the diaspora much, 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 much more. And that is going to mean, like in any relationship, doing certain things that many Israelis might not want to do in order that the other side feels that there's a real relationship here. So, for example, the Kotel. I personally live a 17, 20-minute walk from the Kotel. I probably haven't been there in a decade. And the last time I was there because it was a bar mitzvah that we had to attend. I mean, it's just not my place. I find it very problematic in all different sorts of ways. I never go there. But for a lot of people, that place matters. And whether it's going to be Robinson's Arch or it's going to be some other place, Israel's going to have to do something to make sure that non-Orthodox Jews feel genuinely welcomed when they come to celebrate a life cycle event somewhere in the environs of the kotel. I'm not saying right at the bottom of the main part. I don't care. But I think we're going to have to do a tremendous number of things to make it clear that it's not just lip service. Lip service is not going to pass. American Jews raised $1 billion for us in the first weeks of the war. American Jews are still funding the procurement of army equipment, helmets, vests, and eye protective gear. Those are the three main things for soldiers that the army is not providing, where they're doing real things. They're giving real, genuine money. Real checks are getting cashed. And we have to pay that back with more than lip service. We're going to have to do a tremendous amount to show that if we want this relationship to be real, they're going to give, except a Sparta that's not as Athens much like as they would like. And we're going to have to do things to accept varieties of Jewish life that some Israelis may not be comfortable with, because that's what a relationship is. A relationship is when both sides move towards the middle somehow. And I don't think we as Israelis have done a very good job of that for a while, and that's going to have to shift here too. So there's a new challenge. There's new opportunities for the American-Israel relationship, but there's also new challenges, and both sides are going to have to be very, very smart about that. I'll say one last word about this, is that it's not entirely clear to me who the leadership of the major, the big names of American Jewish leadership are, who are prepared to and able to kind of rethink that dynamic. It's true here too, by the way. I mean, there are some, just like there are some in America, but we're going to both need to engender and generate new kinds of religious leadership that can foster a new kind of dialogue and a new kind of relationship, because it's critical.
Danny, thank you so much for answering my questions. One of the last things you said was we need people who can have a positive Judaism to put forward. And our first question actually comes from Dave Sachs. You may know him from the Gemara card that he authored. It's a little handy tool to help people study Talmud. Dave, it's great to have you. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question directly.
Hi, Danny. Thank you so much for your thought leadership. My question is about calls for Israel to create a day after plan. Given the fact that Hamas started this war, the context of Israeli disengagement, and the long-term goal of separation, should it really be Israel's responsibility? Furthermore, any Israeli plan or perceived Israeli plan for governing Gaza would probably be dead on arrival from the perspective of Palestinian support. Obviously, there are lessons to be learned from the utter failure of relying on the international community for security in Lebanon. But big picture, should Israel be publicly trying to push responsibility of generating a day after plan onto the United States and moderate Sunni states?
It's an excellent question. Obviously, it's good to see you, Dave. It's an excellent question. Look, I think part of the game that Israel's losing here is the game of optics. I think you're quite right that almost anything that Israel would put forward is going to be unacceptable to Hamas. So let them torpedo it. Let the world see that we're putting out ideas and that they're saying no. And so as right before we got online tonight, I saw a thing on Ynet that said that there's 3 moderate Arab states that are willing to take some role in a post-war Gaza, but here's what they're demanding from the states in return. I didn't even get a chance to look and see who those moderate states were. I'm assuming that one of them is Saudi Arabia. That's part of the normalization deal, but I don't actually know. Is it fair? Nothing about this is fair. I mean, in other words, should it be the case that it should not be the case that 1,200 people got slaughtered on October 7th. It should not be the case that all these Israeli women who were raped are too understandably ashamed to come out and talk about it and are therefore not getting cared for. It should not be the case that we have hostages 223 days in, who we can't even begin to get the Red Cross to verify whether they're alive or dead, or to get them the medicines that have been taken in. There's a lot of things about this that are not the way that they should be. So is it fair? No, it's not fair. But the reality of the politics of this is that the world does not want Israel to stay in Gaza. Many Israelis, Benny Gantz, Gallant, millions of Israelis do not want Israel to be in Gaza because they remember why Sharon got us out, because boys were coming out in boxes very, very, very regularly. So I don't know what the solution is, but I know that a prime minister who says, I'm not prepared to have this conversation right now until after Hamas is defeated, when A, it's not clear that Hamas can be defeated, so it looks a little bit like a ploy not to ever have the conversation. B, when Ben Gvir is saying it's time to resettle Gush Katif, which may not be a terrible idea when you think about it, but it's certainly the wrong time to talk about it. And C, when the international community is pressing so hard for some kind of conversation about this, we are definitely losing the war of optics here. And the war of optics is what matters in The Hague, and the war of optics is what matters in the White House, and the war of optics actually, believe it or not, matters on college campuses. So no, it should not be Israel's responsibility to do it, but it is Israel's responsibility to do it because that's what the world's expecting right now. And if we want to keep getting armed and not have arrest warrants out for us and have Jewish students on Columbia and Harvard campuses be able to walk around with their heads held high, we have to do our own step towards that.
Dave, thank you for your question and for joining us. We'll turn out to Michal Goldman, who's an alumna of Harvard. Michal, it's good to see you, and go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Professor Gordis, I have been a reader of your blog, and my question is, you said earlier that it is deeply the moral obligation of the government to do whatever is necessary to return the hostages. And so for me, that raises a question. It seems to me, from what I've understood, that would mean, from the point of view of getting a Hamas agreement, the acceptance of a permanent ceasefire, because I think that has been a Hamas precondition. So my question then becomes, you who know Israel very well, do you think that the Israeli populace, at this point anyway, would accept such a proposition? And two, do you think that there is within the people who might realistically constitute a government, perhaps a post-Netanyahu one, among them, are there those at present who would accept the notion of a permanent ceasefire? And if not, how do you resolve that conundrum?
Right. Now, it's a very, very good and important question. So thank you for it. I think to a large measure, it's an issue of optics, just like the previous question. The hostage families feel abandoned. The hostage families feel like it's not a national priority. If the leadership of the government was meeting with them regularly and explaining to them, not obviously, information that can't be shared, but explaining to them what they're trying to do to get them out, I think most Israelis, I'm not saying where I stand on this, but I think most Israelis would not be in favor of a complete ceasefire that was not alterable. I think most Israelis think that would not be a good idea. The more the war goes on and the more it becomes pretty clear that we're actually not destroying Hamas the way that we were, the number of people willing to make the trade might actually go up. I don't know. But I think we may not be able to get the hostages out, but we have to be able to convince Israelis that we're doing more than we are to try to make it happen. I don't know quite what that is, but there's a sense here, including among the negotiators themselves, who would have no reason to say this if they didn't really feel it, because I'm sure that their jobs are more complicated internally when they say that go public. They're saying that the administration has torpedoed several deals that were very close. If there's any truth to that whatsoever, because I think Bibi's worried about his own political fortunes, then I think that's unforgivable. All their prisoners for all their living hostages and a complete ceasefire, probably untenable, probably not a deal that we can take. But the negotiators are saying that there are other deals to be had. Or is that still possible? Is it still the case that Hamas would compromise on that? I'm the last, I don't know any more than anybody else. But I think, again, the issue of optics and of having the Israeli populace and especially the hostages families feel that this is the foremost, that the first thing that Bibi Netanyahu thinks about when he wakes up in the morning is getting those kids back. Kids, older people, babies, Holocaust survivors, I mean, everybody. And there's not that sense right now. But what the ultimate deal, whether everybody will accept that, it's a very fair question. I'm not sure even what I think about it, but I assume that there's many Israelis who would not.
Michal, thank you for joining. We'll turn on to the final question for today. Joshua Margolis is a professor at Harvard Business School. Josh, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Danny, and thank both Dannys for this session and for your insight. A two-pronged question. In light of your critique of the current Netanyahu government, can you talk about the path to moving on to a next government or path to election? And second is, given your critique, what would you ask of American Jews and those of us who are part of the larger, wider Harvard community?
Okay, so let's start with the first one. The problem that we have is there's no real way to trigger elections until October 26th when the elections are called for. Now, there are people, by the way, I have a podcast coming out soon with a guy named Rotem Sela, who is one of Israel's more important public conservative intellectuals, who actually can't stand Bibi, but actually thinks that the idea that the elections wouldn't happen right away is not such a terrible idea because the opposition isn't ready. His argument, which I don't necessarily share, but it just struck me as interesting. His argument was, if you go back to the polls, it's the same choices. It's Lapid, it's Gantz, it's, maybe Bennett, maybe not Bennett. It's the same choices all over again, and the results might be a little bit different. But his point was the populace needs to be offered something really different, and that has to be given chance to sort of percolate and cook with all these guys that got out of Gaza and the protest movement and Brothers in Arms and all those various groups and the Fourth Quarter group. And there's a lot of other groups out there doing this kind of stuff. I'm not sure I agree with that because I think the damage being done on a day-to-day basis is so grievous. But just wanted to say out there that there are people who are totally opposed to it now who actually think that not having elections now is actually okay. By the same token, there's many people on the right who think desperately that there needs to be elections. So it's not a matter of right-left. It's just a matter of how one sees the political frame. There's no way to trigger these elections. Look, I think the sense of desperation here is growing. Desperation, despondency, call it what you will. The head of the Histadrut, which is the large labor union in Israel, and it's huge, hinted last week for the first time at possibly calling a national strike. The Histadrut is still the one organization that has the capacity to really kind of shut down the country. They can stop the airport from running, they can stop the buses from running, they can stop the trains from running, they can stop hospitals in a lot of ways. They can really do put a tremendous amount of pressure. In a normal world, that would probably do the trick. With Bibi Netanyahu, it's hard to know if that would do the trick. In a normal world, Golda Meir, in a situation like this, stepped down. The Agronat Commission did actually not find her culpable for the war. Some people thought that that was fair. Some people thought that it wasn't. Many people think she was sold short by the Agronat Commission, that she actually did much better during the war than people gave her credit for. But regardless, she was not forced out of office. There were lots of people protesting in the streets, and she said the country needs a new start. But Golda Meir cared about Israel. And Bibi Netanyahu, many people think here, cares about Bibi Netanyahu. So when somebody like Avi Yisacharov, who among many other things is also the writer and creator of Fauda, which gives him a tremendous esteem internationally, says today in the paper that we're being held hostage, but not by Hamas, but by a prime minister, something's in the air. And, a person who was not concerned foremost about his own political fortunes would say, okay, you know what? The country's broken. I've become a point of contention. I'm stepping aside and let the country try to heal. We're not there yet. So what could bring it about is possibly, I suppose, possibly a Histadrut strike. Another possibility is the beginning of a government investigation, which the Attorney General has now said neither the government nor the army, both of which want to block it right now, have the right to block it. So that investigation is going to apparently proceed. There could be, I suppose, some uncovering of facts about what actually happened on October 6th. That would lead people to say, oh my God, this is much worse than I thought. Just to give you one quick example, when General Khalifa, who was the head of military intelligence, just resigned, whatever he did during Pesach, what came out, which was pretty extraordinary, was he was on vacation with his family in Eilat. That's legitimate. He's got a right to go on vacation. He's like anybody else. It's Pesach for him like everybody else. According to the papers, I'm just telling you what's in the papers. I can't vouch for it personally, but in the papers, it was said that he was called at about 2 o'clock in the morning, early in the morning of the 7th, and told that there's some stuff that they're seeing that doesn't look normal. And he apparently heard it out and said, I think it's nothing, it's probably a drill. And he went back to sleep. Okay. Then they tried to call him a couple of hours later with more information, and he turned his phone off. Now, if that is the case, that is unforgivable. That you would be the head of military intelligence, there are already warnings on your plate, and you're on vacation in Eilat, so you decide to turn off your phone. Again, I'm saying I'm just telling you what I read. I don't know if it's true or not. But things like that could come out about Netanyahu and others that could lead to such national rage that that could bring it about. It's also very possible that the hostages, it's going to become clear that more and more of the hostages have died in captivity and that they might have been saved and something else done. It's not clear what's going to trigger this, but something could trigger, I think, the bubbling sense of rage here and just get people to go to the streets. 1 million people can't be dispersed by water cannons. 10,000 can, but 1 million can't. And so if they take to the highways and they take to the busy streets, and it's possible, I guess, to force the government to resign, but I think we're far away from that still, barring any unforeseen trigger that I don't really imagine what it could be. That's that. In terms of the American Jewish community, look, I mean, I took a lot of heat during the judicial thing for signing a letter or writing a letter with Mati Friedman and Yossi Klein Halevi, asking American Jewish leaders to get involved and to try to put pressure on the Israeli government. We took a tremendous amount of heat for that, heat being a gentle term. But okay, you know, that was the way it was. We felt that if, probably foolishly, not naively, we thought there was some small chance that we were going to give Bibi a ladder to climb down from the tree, which we thought he wanted, that if the heads of AIPAC and the AJC and others had come out and said, the Conference of Presidents had all said, you gotta back down. You're not going to be able to have our support unless you back down. He might have been able to say to Rothman, look, I can't do this. I'm going to not allow myself a breach with American Judaism. So I'm going to back down. So having said that, on this particular issue, I don't really think there's anything that American Jews can do. I mean, this is really not that it should be, it just is an internal Israeli issue for the voting public. I kind of wish that there was other leverages that can be put on. I would love to see it changed in any way whatsoever. This is not a stay out of this. It's our business argument. It's just I don't think there's any leverage that can really be placed. I mean, to their great credit, American Jews have shown that their loyalty to Israel is extraordinary. And when it comes to saving Israeli soldiers, they're going to raise money and do the right thing, which is really an unbelievably great story here. But I think it's just going to depend on some particular trigger that I can't at the moment envision. To allow the bubbling national rage to come to the surface and to immobilize the country in such a way that Netanyahu understands that he has to resign. But as I said before, and I'm repeating myself, I think we're pretty far away from that still.
Joshua, always good to see you. Thank you for joining. Danny, thank you for your time and your wisdom. You've gone overtime here. Obviously very sobering, but I certainly appreciate your honesty and authenticity. And I do hope, I'm sort of an eternal optimist, that things can get better, and that the next time we speak, things will be in hopefully a more positive place. For those of you who are interested in learning more from Danny, we got 13 books to read, but also you should follow his Substack and his podcast. And I think those are really wonderful opportunities to learn more from him, and always very insightful and has a good beat on what's going on in Israel. Danny, thank you. Really, it's just been a pleasure to know you.
Thank you very much.
It's
really an honor. It's great to see you. And, our anthem is Hatikva, so I share with you the hope that there will be hope.
Amen. Great. And I look forward to seeing you in person soon also.
I do too. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you everyone so much for joining. Have a wonderful rest of your day.